What's worse than being thrown out onto the street on Christmas Eve? It's finding out, right then and there, that the life you've lived up to this point has been a lie. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button on our channel. What city are you listening to this story from? Write it in the comments. Now let's continue. Up until that moment, my world was a well-rehearsed lullaby. Tree put up, the smell of cookies in the air, the promise of a happy tomorrow. I lived the illusion of a perfect family, of an unconditional love I believed was unbreakable. But in the blink of an eye, beneath the false glow of the Christmas lights, the door slammed shut with a bang that echoed not just on the icy street, but in the hollow cavern of my chest. And it wasn't just the December cold that pierced my soul, but the shattering of every memory, of every bond one believed was real, revealing an abyss of deceit. That night, the darkness wasn't out there, it dwelled inside me, exposed by the raw light of an unbearable truth. I was standing there, still, feeling the cold drive its needles into my exposed skin. It wasn't just the biting wind or the snow accumulating on my worn-out sneakers. It was a cold that came from within, from the place where my heart should be, now turned into a frozen desert. The door, that very door I had crossed thousands of times, which represented security and belonging, was shut. Shut forever. And, behind it, silence. A silence that screamed absence, rejection, the death of everything I knew. The words still echoed in my head, a cruel and relentless refrain: "You are not our real child. Get out of here." Every syllable was a hammer beating against my mind, which refused to organize the chaos. My brain spun pointlessly, trying to find a logic, an explanation, reason star. But there was nothing. Just the naked, raw cruelty, without veils or mitigating factors. My suitcase, a pathetic and insignificant object, lay in the snow beside me. It was the only visible sign of my former life, a pile of clothes and belongings that, suddenly, seemed no longer to belong to me. Like an extra who was kicked off the main stage, I was thrown out, without a script, without a character, without a destination. The white of the snow seemed to mock my newly bleached existence, washed clean of every single color that once defined it. I remember the look. Their look. On the faces I had called Mom and Dad for 22 years, there was no sadness, anger, or regret. There was only repulsion. An icy aversion that hit me deeper than any slap, any shout. It was as if, suddenly, I had turned into something filthy, a plague that needed to be eradicated. Those eyes, which once looked at me with what I believed was love, now saw me as a stranger, an imposter. A blow colder than the biting wind, more lethal than the truth itself. I couldn't cry. Tears seemed frozen in the depths of my soul, unable to melt the layer of shock that enveloped me. My throat was tight, as if an invisible knot prevented me from breathing, from screaming, from begging for an explanation. But who would I beg? The people who had just destroyed me, who dismantled my reality in a flash. I was alone. Completely, irremediably alone. Aimless. My mind in tatters, trying in vain to piece together the fragments of a life that was never mine. Every memory, every laugh, every hug, everything dissolved, revealing itself to be a carefully orchestrated sham. The house, once a sanctuary of memories, was now a prison of lies. Every photo on the wall, every conversation at the table, every "I love you," everything turned into the dust of deception. What would I do now? Where would I go? On that Christmas Eve night, while the rest of the world prepared to celebrate the warmth of home and family, I was a castaway in an ocean of ice. The city, lit up with festive lights, seemed like a cruel irony, a reminder of what I had just lost, or rather, what I never had. I was a ghost, a shadow, a mistake. The total absence of explanation was what gnawed at me the most. Why now? Why this way? Why did they lie for so long? These questions spun in an infernal loop in my head, without answers, without relief. It was as if they had ripped a piece of me out and thrown it away, without even bothering to explain why. I crouched down in the snow, the weight of the suitcase seeming to crush my shoulders, already bowed by the shock. The cold seeped into my bones, but it was the emptiness inside me that hurt the most. I wasn't just a rejected child, I was a blank slate, without a past, without a true name, without an identity. The unbearable truth wasn't out there, in the cruel words or the look of repulsion. It dwelled inside me, exposed by the raw light of an existence that, until that moment, I had never known was a lie. And now, I had to survive it. Somehow. I was there, sitting on a freezing bench at a deserted bus station. The cold of the snow clinging to my clothes was nothing compared to the emptiness gnawing inside me. Their words, "You are not our real child. Get out of here," still echoed, every syllable a whip lashing my soul. My suitcase, the same one they had tossed into the snow with such contempt, lay at my feet, a heap of fabric and plastic containing what remained of my existence. They were few things, thrown there in a hurry, carelessly, without love. Just like me. My fingers, numb from the cold and the inertia of shock, fumbled over the rough surface of the suitcase fabric. I needed something, anything, to anchor me to reality, to distract me from the abyss opening beneath my feet. Perhaps a warmer sweater, a pair of socks. The truth is, I just wanted to feel something other than the searing pain of rejection. I opened the zipper with difficulty, the metallic sound scraping against the heavy silence of the early morning. The few items of clothing were there, crumpled, mixed with some old books and a toothbrush. Nothing of sentimental value, nothing that truly belonged to me, except perhaps the memories I now knew were false. With a trembling hand, I rummaged through the contents, searching for a point of comfort, a crumb of familiarity. And that's when my fingers brushed against something hard, smooth, and strangely alien to the touch. It wasn't metal, nor plastic. It was wood. An old wood, polished by time, with a texture that told silent stories. I pulled it out, and under the weak light of the bus station lamp, my tear-filled eyes fixed on it. It was a small box, no bigger than the palm of my hand. A deep, dark brown, almost mahogany, with worn edges and a subtle sheen that hinted at years of handling. But what truly captured me was what was engraved on the lid, a crest. A strange crest. It wasn't a symbol I knew. It didn't belong to any of my family memories, the false memories I now knew. It wasn't the crest of the city where I grew up, nor the insignia of any school or club I had attended. It was complex, with intertwined geometric shapes and what looked like two stylized animal figures, perhaps lions or griffins, facing each other. In the center, an ornate letter, which I couldn't immediately identify, lost amidst such rich detail. My mind, which until then seemed like a blank canvas covered by the fog of despair, began to process new information. A subtle discord, a loose thread in a tapestry I thought I knew, began to pull my curiosity away from my immediate pain. That box wasn't mine. I had never seen it before. It didn't come from home. How did it end up in my suitcase? The initial shock of discovery gave way to a wave of strangeness. I turned the box over in my hands, feeling its surprising weight for its size. It was certainly an antique object, imbued with an aura of mystery. What was inside? And, more importantly, why was it there? No one in my family ever had anything like it. They were simple, practical people, averse to any kind of adornment or object with history. This box seemed to belong to another world, another life. The revelation that I wasn't their son had torn the veil of my existence, exposing a colossal lie. Now, this box was like a new crack in that veil, showing that the lie was even deeper, more intricate than I had imagined. It wasn't just about who I was or where I came from, it was about what else they hid. A part of me wanted to throw it away, ignore it, plunge back into the numbing comfort of my self-pity. But another part, the one that always sought the truth, even unknowingly, felt an irresistible pull. That box was a clue. A single, solitary, but powerful clue in the middle of the nothingness my life had become. It was the tip of the iceberg, proof that there was something more, something hidden and perhaps much bigger than the simple rejection I had just suffered. My eyes, still damp, now fixed on the box with a different intensity. It was no longer pain that filled them, but a mix of apprehension and a spark of hope. If they hid this, if this was in my suitcase, it meant there was a story. A real story, perhaps, that wasn't theirs. And for the first time since I was thrown onto the street, I felt an impetus that wasn't to give up. I needed to know. I had to open that box. The truth, however harsh, was the only thing I could seek now. And it seemed to be contained right there, in the palm of my hand, waiting to be revealed. I was there, frozen, not only by the cold seeping in through the poorly closed window, but by a sensation spreading from the inside out, like a dark ink stain on white fabric. The small wooden box, strangely heavy in the palm of my hand, was the only real thing amid the chaos of my collapsing life. The crest carved on it, what crest was that, seemed to vibrate with a secret, and each pulsation was a reminder that I was on the brink of something irreversible. My hands trembled slightly, no longer from the haste of an escape, but from the strange stillness that the discovery of that object had imposed on me. The pain of loss, which until then had crushed me, retreated a step, making way for a chilling, almost profane curiosity. As my fingers grazed the aged wood, a veil began to tear in my mind. It wasn't an abrupt tear, but a slow, almost imperceptible disintegration of everything I thought I knew. I began to revisit memories, not the ones I held dear, but those I had pushed into the darkest corners, disguised as irrelevant or mere family eccentricities. Now, they didn't seem irrelevant, they seemed like deliberately hidden pieces of a puzzle I never knew I was putting together. I remember my mother. Her eyes. When I was a child, maybe 7 or 8, innocence still allowed me to ask questions that, today, I would never ask. Mom, what was I like as a baby? Was I a funny baby? I expected the effusion of affection, the story with comical details, the laughter that always accompanied the memories of my siblings. But with her, it was different. Her eyes, always so expressive when she talked about anything else, would become distant. A fleeting gleam, almost of pain, would cross her face before she composed herself into a mask of evasion. "Oh, you were a quiet baby," she would say, or "you were always very independent," quickly changing the subject, as if deflecting a blow. I sensed, even as a child, that there was something more there, an untold story, an empty space she refused to fill. At the time, I just accepted it, interpreting it as a peculiarity of hers, or perhaps mine. Now, the emptiness screamed. And their jokes. How blind I was. At family gatherings, between laughs and glasses of wine, comments would surface that I always dismissed as the twisted humor of relatives. "This one isn't quite our kind," my father would joke, slapping my back with a force that never seemed affectionate. Or, "He must have been found in a basket on the doorstep, he's so different," my aunt would laugh, and everyone would join in, except me. I would offer a strained smile, forcing a naturalness I didn't feel. They would say, "It's just kidding, kid." But the truth, naked and raw, was that I felt the weight of those words. I felt like an alien, an observer in my own family. An intruder. I always wondered why the jokes about me always had that edge of exclusion, while with my siblings, they were about mischief or affectionate nicknames. The box in my hand now seemed like the key to unlocking the hidden meaning behind each of those jokes. Then, the family albums. The albums. They were a treasure trove for my siblings. Page after page of their first steps, their gap-toothed smiles, their first, second, third birthdays. The stories were endless, the details vivid. My mother and father pointed to each photo, recounting the exploits of each child. But when we reached my pages, there was an awkward silence. "Your baby pictures, they got lost in the move," was the most common excuse. Or, "We had a problem with damp, and many were ruined." Always a vague, generic justification that I, as a child, swallowed without question. There was never a photo of me as a newborn, a baby, a small child, none of those showing the transition from the cradle to life. It was as if my life only began to be documented after a certain age, as if I had been inserted into the family at some point, not born into it. That absence wasn't just of images, it was the absence of a history, of a past that should have been mine. Each of these fragments, previously scattered and minimized, now connected. My mother's discretion, the exclusionary jokes, the gap in the albums. They were not isolated incidents, but the ends of a thread I had ignored my whole life. I always had this subtle disconnect, this feeling of being an observer in my own life, watching family scenes without truly belonging to them. It was as if I had a different script, a secondary role where I should have been the protagonist. The box seemed to be the prologue, the first chapter of a story they never told me. The stillness in my apartment, as the city slept under a veil of snow, was the perfect canvas for this painful revelation. The puzzle forming was not a puzzle of happy memories, but a dark mosaic of hidden truths, of a past that wasn't quite mine. The immediate pain of loss, the loss of my father, gave way to an older, deeper pain, the pain of a stolen or, at the very least, distorted identity. The wooden box, once just an object out of place, was now a portal, an invitation to unearth the truth that seemed to be contained right there, in the palm of my hand, waiting to be revealed. And I, no matter how much it hurt, felt I needed to open it. The wooden box, previously an object of distant curiosity, became my catalyst. My hands trembled as I opened it, the creak of the old wood echoing in the silence of my room, a sound that seemed to tear the veil of everything I knew. Inside, rested the objects described in the diary, an old, darkened, crafted metal key, heavy in the palm of my hand, and a piece of yellowed, folded, and worn paper, with an almost illegible address. The key. To what door? To what secret? Its presence was a tactile enigma, a silent promise of access to something long locked away. But it was the paper that stole my attention, my breath. With almost reverent care, I unfolded it. The ink was faded, the letters danced and merged, like ghosts of words refusing to be fully seen. Every wrinkle in the paper seemed to contain a lifetime of untold stories. Fear mixed with a wild adrenaline rush, a primal urgency. I knew, with every fiber of my being, that address was Ariadne's thread for the labyrinth of my own existence. It was a plunge into forbidden territory, a path I knew could destroy what little sanity, what little identity, I had left. But curiosity, the need for truth, was a hungry monster that could no longer be ignored. Nights turned into days, and days into blurs of obsession. My mind, previously fragmented by flashes of memory, now fixed on deciphering that address. I used an old magnifying glass, illuminated the paper from every conceivable angle, compared the faded traces with old handwriting found in books and online. Every letter I managed to discern was a small victory, a minuscule piece in a colossal puzzle. Street, number, neighborhood. Gradually, a sequence of words began to emerge, a coordinate to the epicenter of my past. With the address partially deciphered, I began my silent search. The internet was my first battlefield, a vast ocean of information where I hoped to find some island of truth. I typed in the fragments I had, searching for old maps, property records, any mention of that location. The first searches were frustrating, full of dead ends, names and dates that didn't fit. With every failure, a knot of despair tightened in my chest, but I refused to give up. The urgency was palpable, the feeling that every lost minute was another minute spent living a lie. My journey then led me to dusty libraries, where the smell of old paper and mildew seemed to permeate the very atmosphere. I scoured microfiches, flipped through old newspaper clippings, consulted directories and phone books from past decades. My eyes burned with fatigue, but with every record, every name or date I found, my resolve strengthened. I was a detective of my own life, an archaeologist excavating the ruins of a forgotten history. There, between yellowed pages of a property catalogue from 1970, I found the first solid clue. The address, once a tangle of scribbles, now took shape. It wasn't a common residence, as I expected. The descriptions were vague, but suggested a type of institution. Something like a home or a reception center. The word orphanage wasn't there, but the implication hung in the air like a cold mist, chilling my bones. The discovery was a shock, an icy wave of recognition that coursed through my entire body. I had always felt like a stranger, an observer in my own life, and now, that feeling had a dark justification. Their jokes about me being different, my mother's distant look when I asked about my childhood, the absence of baby pictures in the family albums, everything began to fit into a cruel pattern. I wasn't just different, I was, perhaps, a late addition, a broken link in the family chain I believed was mine. The search became even more intense, more feverish. I needed to know more about that institution. What kind of place was it? Who ran it? What were its records? Questions piled up in my mind, each one a painful thorn. With every piece of information I unearthed, the wall I had built around my identity began to crack. I watched my entire life disintegrate before my eyes, but I couldn't stop. The truth, however painful, was an irresistible call. The old key in my hand and the almost deciphered address on the paper were now more than objects, they were portals. Portals to a truth that promised to be impactful and revealing, but also devastating. I was on the edge of an abyss, but the need to jump was stronger than the fear of falling. What little remained of my old life was about to be consumed by the flames of truth, and I was ready to burn. I needed to know. I deserved to know. And I, no matter how much it hurt, felt I needed to open the door that key promised. I was there, on the threshold of that old registry office, the smell of aged paper and mildew enveloping me like an icy hug. The key, cold and heavy in the palm of my hand, seemed to vibrate with an energy of its own, an inescapable call to the abyss I feared. The interior was a labyrinth of dusty files, shelves extending to the ceiling, guarding stories of lives I would never know. But my story was there, I knew it. There was one specific drawer, one of thousands, that the key promised to open. My eyes swept the room, every corner seeming to hide secrets, until I found the number that the almost illegible address had revealed to me. It was a discreet number, almost faded by time, on a dark wooden drawer, in the most forgotten part of the archive. My hands trembled as I inserted the key. The click, surprisingly soft, reverberated in the heavy silence of the place, a sound that seemed to tear the veil of my own ignorance. I slowly opened the drawer, as if fearing what I would find, but at the same time, driven by an unstoppable force. Inside, wrapped in faded linen fabric, was a small bundle of yellowed papers. The air seemed to thin in my lungs. I pulled them out, the faint light of the lamp hanging from the ceiling revealing the marks of time, the creases, and the almost illegible stamps. The first document, a birth certificate, was the oldest, the paper thin and brittle under my fingers. My eyes scanned the elegant, faded handwriting, searching for my name, the name I knew, which was my only anchor. And it was there. But the names of my parents, they weren't them. They weren't the names I had memorized, that I had loved and hated at different times in my life. They were completely strange, unknown names, as if they had been torn from a life that wasn't mine. The shock was visceral, a punch to the gut that stole my breath, the floor beneath my feet seemed to give way. I reread it, every syllable, every letter, looking for an error, an explanation, an escape from the truth staring coldly at me. But there was no mistake. That was my name, my date of birth, but with other parents. Who were they? Who was I, after all? My mind spun, trying to process the anomaly, the impossibility. And then, below the birth certificate, there was another document. Sealed. With an old wax stamp, cracked by time. It was an adoption certificate. There was the brutal truth, printed on paper, cold and undeniable. An adoption certificate, dated a few months after my birth, registering the transfer of my identity, my life, to those I had always called parents. The lie. A lie woven over decades, so perfect that I never questioned it, never felt it, never imagined it. In that instant, the world I knew collapsed, pulverized into 1,000 pieces. It wasn't a slow crumbling, but a violent, silent implosion that only I could feel. The identity I had built, the memories I held, the bonds I believed were unbreakable, everything proved to be a facade, a carefully orchestrated illusion. I felt stolen. Stolen of a fundamental truth, of an origin, of who I truly was. My knees gave way, and I leaned on the dusty shelf, my hands clutching the documents as if they were the only real thing in that moment. The tears came, hot and bitter, not of sadness, but of a deep existential pain, a silent fury. How could they? How could they live such a big, fundamental lie, beside me, for an entire lifetime? Every laugh, every scolding, every hug, every "I love you," everything was now stained by doubt, by betrayal. I was not who I thought I was. My parents were not my parents. My story was a sham. My breath came in short, painful gasps, as I tried to absorb the magnitude of that revelation. It was as if they had ripped the ground out from under my feet, leaving me floating in a cold void, aimless, without a true name, without a true past. The key, which once promised answers, had now handed me a Pandora's box of pain and despair. I had opened the door. And the truth I found did not free me, but imprisoned me in a new and terrible reality. I could barely breathe on the way back home. The documents, now crumpled and cold in my trembling hands, were an unbearable weight, a burden that burned. Every step was a stab, every turn in the street, a reminder of the years of lies that stretched throughout my life. The world outside looked the same, indifferent, but mine had collapsed. I was not who I thought I was. They were not who I thought they were. The front door, once a safe harbor, now looked like the entrance to a minefield. I opened it with a creak that echoed in the heavy silence of my soul. They were in the living room, reading the newspaper, watching TV, in their banal, lying routines. No wrinkle on their faces betrayed the sham they had maintained for decades. Or maybe, yes, every wrinkle was a scar from that sham. My eyes fixed on them, laden with the weight of a truth I didn't know how to unload. I couldn't just throw the papers on the table and scream. Something held me back. Perhaps the fear of destroying what little was left, perhaps the insane hope that there was an explanation, a nuance, that would make everything less brutal. Mom. Dad. My voice came out hoarse, almost a whisper, breaking the false tranquility of the environment. They looked up, slightly annoyed by the interruption. We need to talk. The air grew thick, heavy. I sat on the opposite sofa, the documents hidden in my pocket, but the truth screaming in every cell of my body. Have you ever thought about how different things would be if they had gone another way, at the beginning? They exchanged glances. A quick, almost imperceptible look, but one that did not escape me. A code, a password of complicity in the lie, exchanged in fractions of a second. What nonsense is this, son? My father tried to laugh, but the sound was fake, scratched, like a broken record. Things are the way they are. They always have been. Always have been. I repeated, my voice taking on a sharper tone, almost a cut. My eyes didn't leave theirs, searching for any fissure in the armor, any tremor that would betray the truth. Have you never had secrets? Has there never been something you failed to tell me? My mother lowered her gaze to her hands, which suddenly seemed very interesting. My father cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses, in an attempt to deflect the focus. The tension in the room was palpable, like a stretched wire about to snap at any moment. What kind of question is that? We're too old for games, son, he said, his voice hardening. The tone was a clear reprimand, a warning for me to back off. But I couldn't. The truth, now unearthed, drove me forward, relentless. It's not games, Dad. It's about who I am. Who we are. The silence that followed was deafening. A heavy silence, laden with years of omission and stifled truths. I saw the anger in their eyes, an anger that was not directed at my question, but at the threat it posed to their carefully constructed facade. They were furious that I had dared. That I had gotten so close. My mother finally lifted her face, her blue eyes, once so tender, now hard as stone. I don't know what you're talking about. Your history is the one you lived with us. The one we built together. But what if that's not the complete story? I insisted, my voice choked with rising emotion. Tears threatened to come, but I held them back. I needed to be strong, for myself, for who I was and for who I was becoming. What if there's another story? Before ours. My father stood up abruptly, knocking the newspaper to the floor with a dry thud that echoed in my ears. Enough. I won't allow this stupid insinuation in my house. You're making things up, maybe you're stressed. You need rest. He tried to hug me, a gesture that once would have calmed me, brought me comfort, but now seemed like an effort to silence me, to wrap me back into his web of lies. I dodged, stepping back, feeling a shudder. "I'm not making anything up," I said, my voice almost a growl, laden with frustration and pain. "I just want the truth." My mother's face contorted. Not in sadness, but in a mix of fury and despair. "The truth is we loved you. We raised you, we gave you everything." Her voice rose in volume, a desperate defense, almost a battle cry. "What more do you want? More than that doesn't exist." "It exists. The truth exists," I replied, looking at them, one by one. Both had erected an impenetrable wall of cold, unwavering stone. Their eyes evaded mine, fleeing the mirror of truth that I reflected. They refused to look at me, at the invisible but present evidence I carried in my broken heart. Their anger was not just a defense, it was a brutal confirmation. The silence that hung between us, the evasion, the eyes that refused to meet mine, were more eloquent than any confession. They didn't need to say yes for me to know. The furious no, the evasive no, the desperate no was their yes I feared so much. In that instant, the last spark of hope for a simple explanation, for a misunderstanding, went out inside me. They wouldn't give me the truth. They would keep it, buried under layers of denial, until the end of their days. I was alone with my discovery, and the loneliness was a heavy, almost crushing burden. The world I knew didn't just collapse, it crushed me along with it. And the truth I found did not free me, but imprisoned me in a new and terrible reality. The forgotten voice of the past. Their denial was a punch to the gut, a dull thud that reverberated in every fiber of my being. The truth I had unearthed, so solid and undeniable in my hands, was thrown back at me, dirty with the anger and disdain of those who did not want to see. I was alone, more alone than ever, with the birth certificate crumpled by the sweat of my hands and the shadow of what I thought was my family projecting over me like an executioner. The air at home became dense, unbreathable, laden with a silence that screamed betrayal and secrets. I couldn't stay there anymore. That piece of paper, once a sign of liberation, was now a map to an unknown past, a promise of pain, but also of answers. I needed to know. I needed to find the names on the certificate, the lost links of my true origin. My search began chaotically, desperately. I scoured public records, old yellow pages, anything that could give me a thread. Every name, every old address, was a cold lead, a dead end that increased the anguish. I felt like an amateur detective, but with every closed door, every call that led nowhere, hope diminished, replaced by a fatigue that weighed more than the secret itself. Days stretched into weeks. My nights were populated by nightmares and my mind, by endless questions. Where were they? Who were they? Why was I left behind? The city, once home, now seemed like a labyrinth of false memories. I wandered aimlessly, visiting old neighborhoods, observing houses that might have witnessed my earliest childhood. It was on one of these melancholy walks, on a cobbled street forgotten by time, that chance, or perhaps fate, intervened. I was standing in front of a house with a faded facade, with a small garden that seemed to have seen better days. Something about that atmosphere drew me in, a strange intuition, a whisper from the past. As I watched, an elderly woman, small and hunched, came out to water the wilting flowers. Her hair was white as snow, and her eyes. They carried the depth of a lifetime of stories and a sadness that touched me deep in my soul. She noticed me, and her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that seemed to recognize me. "Can I help you, young man?" Her voice was soft, almost a lament, but filled with a sweetness I hadn't heard in a long time. I felt a warmth rise in my chest. I'm looking for information. About a family that lived around here many years ago. Maybe you know them. Their surnames from the certificate. A tremor crossed her face. Her thin lips curved into an expression of pain and compassion. She invited me in, and her house, though simple, was a sanctuary of memories, full of black and white photographs and antique furniture. We sat in her living room, and she offered me hot tea, her wrinkled hands trembling slightly. "Yes, my son. I knew them very well, she began, her voice choked. They were neighbors here, next door. Such a young couple, so full of life and love. Father's name, and mother's name. They were soulmates, you know. And then, you came. A beautiful baby, with your father's eyes and your mother's smile. Every word of hers was a bullseye hit to my heart, a revelation that tore the veil of ignorance. I could barely breathe, absorbing every syllable, every pause, every expression of pain on her face. But life is cruel sometimes, she continued, a tear rolling down her cheek. It was a horrible accident. A car trip, on a night of heavy rain. They were gone, both of them, so soon. You were so small, barely a year old. No one was left to take care of you. Their family was distant, and your parents, well, they were also only children. The world spun. My biological parents. Dead. An accident. The image of them, which I never had, formed in my mind, young, passionate, and now, ghosts. The pain of loss, which I never knew existed, flooded me. An ancestral, dormant pain, now awakening with full force. The social workers came, she continued, her voice almost a whisper. Your mother's sister, who lived far away, came for the funeral. She couldn't take care of you, she wasn't able. But she wanted the best. She promised you would be adopted by a good family, that you would have a better life. A secret adoption, so you wouldn't carry the weight of the tragedy so early. So you could have a new start. Her last words echoed in the silence of the room, each one a blow and a balm. A secret adoption. A better life. My biological parents, killed in a tragic accident, didn't abandon me. They were taken. And the decision to give me to a new family was an act of desperate love, an attempt to protect me from the pain they could no longer feel. The pain of the past, finally revealed, was a bittersweet embrace. A knot untied in my chest, but another, of deep sorrow and delayed grief, tightened my throat. I was not an unwanted child. I was an orphan of tragedy, a survivor of a cruel destiny. And, for the first time in my life, I knew who I was. I wasn't just the child of my adoptive parents, I was also the child of father's name, and mother's name, whose lives were cut short too early, but whose love, somehow, had found me again through the forgotten voice of a neighbor. The truth, in its rawness and its beauty, consumed me. I was broken, yet whole. I was at peace, yet grieving. And the journey, I knew, was just beginning. Mrs. Maria's door closed behind me, but the echo of her words resonated like thunder in my mind. The daylight seemed blurred, the colors of the world faded. I walked the streets, but my feet didn't feel the ground. It was as if gravity had been suspended, and I floated in a vacuum of disbelief and pain. The truth, finally revealed, was a burden too heavy to carry alone. It was not the liberation I expected, but a silent condemnation. I cried. I cried like never before. Not just for my biological parents, those two young people that life stole too early, whom I never knew and whose existence had been denied to me until then. I cried for the promise of a love that never blossomed, for hugs I never received, for stories they never told me. It was a phantom grief, a pain for a life that should have been mine and that was brutally snatched away before it even began. But, above all, I cried for the child I was. That naive boy, living a sham, believing every word, every smile, every gesture of affection. The grief was double, a wound opening in two opposite but equally deep directions. There was the loss of the past, the irreparable absence of a family that belonged to me by right of blood. And there was the betrayal of the present, the cruel realization that my own history had been manipulated, rewritten by hands I trusted blindly. Every happy memory with my parents, every dusty photo, every birthday celebration, was now tinged with the bitterness of manipulation. The warmth of a maternal hug transformed into a cold grasp, an invisible barrier separating me from the truth. The paternal laugh, once a sound of security, now echoed as a dissonant melody, full of unspoken secrets. I felt like a ghost. I wandered through a life that suddenly no longer belonged to me. The apartment where I grew up, the objects I collected, the streets I walked, everything felt strange, like a theater set assembled for a play of which I was the involuntary protagonist, without knowing the real script. My own body seemed unfamiliar. Who was I? The one they created, or the one genetics had determined? My reflection in the mirror no longer brought me familiarity. The eyes were mine, yes, but the gaze they returned was that of a stranger, someone searching for himself amidst ruins. With every step, a new internal revelation. That time my mother cried seeing a baby in the park, and I thought it was out of emotion, now seemed to have a different meaning, a hidden pain. That insistence on never talking about distant relatives, always justified with the excuse of the small family, was now a wall erected to hide the truth. The clues were there, scattered throughout my existence, like breadcrumbs left by a cruel destiny, but I, in my forced innocence, had never seen them. The pain was not just emotional, it was physical. An oppression in my chest that barely let me breathe, a throbbing migraine that hammered my temples, a lump in my throat that prevented any scream of relief or despair. I felt as if my essence was being torn in half, one side pulling towards the loyalty of years of built-up love, and the other towards the anger and sorrow of the stolen truth. The love I felt for them didn't disappear, but became murky, mixed with deep resentment and a feeling of violation. How can one love and hate at the same time? How can one forgive a lie that shaped their entire existence? Night fell, and with it, the terror of silence. At home, the emptiness was deafening. Every room seemed to echo the lie. I couldn't sleep. I closed my eyes and saw the faces of my biological parents, unknown, but now so real in my mind. I opened my eyes and saw the faces of my adoptive parents, familiar, but now so distant. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable. I had built my life on quicksand, and now it was crumbling. I was naked, exposed, without roots, without a true history. The grief for the life that wasn't was overwhelming, an ocean of despair threatening to swallow me whole. And the only thing I knew was that I needed to find a way to the surface, before I sank completely. The darkness, which once seemed an insurmountable abyss, began to give way to a faint, almost imperceptible sliver of light. I was sinking, yes, but the unbearable pain of not knowing who I was, of feeling my ground crumble, lit a spark of desperation that turned into an iron will to fight. I needed to breathe, I needed to find the surface. It was in this moment of extreme vulnerability that the neighbor, Dona Lucia, a woman with sweet eyes and silent wisdom, approached me. She saw me wasting away day after day, noticed the light leaving my eyes, their vitality draining away. One day, she simply knocked on my door, bringing a piece of cornmeal cake and an attentive ear. I didn't need to say much, my tear-filled eyes and the tremor in my hands told the story. And she, with a surprising sensitivity, merely said, "Sometimes, to move forward, we need to look back. And you don't have to do it alone, my dear." Her words were a balm. She didn't judge me, didn't advise me to forget or forgive. She simply offered me company. And so, almost imperceptibly, Dona Lucia became my compass, my anchor in the turbulent days ahead. She had an impressive knowledge of local history, an enviable memory for names and surnames, and a network of contacts that spanned the entire city and surrounding areas. "Let's start with the basics," she said calmly, flipping through old church e-books and birth register notebooks, many of them handwritten and dusty. The task was monumental. Each document was a labyrinth of unknown names, confusing dates. My eyes burned, my head ached, but with every line, every name, I felt a pulse of hope. Dona Lucia was tireless. She called old friends, visited registry offices in neighboring towns, even talked to gravediggers in old cemeteries, looking for clues, for a thread that would connect me to somewhere. It was amateur detective work, guided by her intuition and my own visceral need for answers. The first great revelation came from an exhaustive search of baptism records from a small rural chapel, over 100 kilometers away. A name jumped out at Dona Lucia, Maria da Penher Silver. The date of birth, the parents' names, everything seemed to fit. My heart raced. It was a common name, yes, but the way she found it, the feeling I had seen it written, was different. It was an echo. With that name in hand, the next step was even more challenging, finding descendants. Dona Lucia, with her admirable persistence, managed to find an address of an old farm where the Silver family had lived. We drove there, on a muggy, tense day. With every kilometer we approached, a mix of fear and excitement consumed me. What would I find? Rejection? Indifference? Or, perhaps, a piece of myself? We arrived at a simple, old house, surrounded by a wild and beautiful garden. As I knocked on the door, my hands were sweating. An elderly woman, with white hair in a braid and a suspicious look, opened the door. Dona Lucia, with her usual sweetness, explained the situation, careful not to be invasive, but sincere. The woman, who introduced herself as Dona Celeste, was Maria da Penher's second cousin. She invited us in, visibly intrigued. Inside the house, time seemed to have stopped. Antique furniture, the smell of wood and lavender. And then, I saw it. On a dusty dresser, there was a metal picture frame. In it, a faded photograph. A young woman, with a shy smile and eyes that were mine. It was the same curve in the nose, the same shape of the lips. My breath caught. I wasn't just seeing a photo, I was seeing myself in a past version. Maria da Penher. Dona Celeste, seeing my reaction, picked up the frame and handed it to me. "That's Maria da Penher," she said, her voice choked with memory. She was such a cheerful girl, so full of life. But she had a difficult life, poor thing. As she spoke, I barely heard the words. My fingers traced the contour of the face in the photograph, feeling a deep and undeniable connection. It was as if a mirror had been placed before me, reflecting not my present, but my genetic past. Dona Celeste, little by little, began to open the memory chest. She spoke of aunts and uncles I never knew existed, of distant cousins scattered throughout the interior. She told stories of Maria da Penher's childhood, of her passion for flowers and for a man who left her pregnant and disappeared. Every word was a revelation, a brick in the reconstruction of a fragmented identity. She showed me other photos, old albums. I saw traces of my family in unknown faces, in smiles that looked like mine, in eyes that carried the same melancholy. It was painful, yes, to hear about the difficult life of my biological mother, about the circumstances that led her to give me up for adoption. Every detail was a cut, a wound that opened again, but this time, with the light of truth. It was no longer an empty story, it was the story of a real person, who carried my blood, who gave birth to me. And I, finally, was no longer alone on this journey. Every discovery was one more thread weaving the tapestry of my identity. I began to understand where my passion for gardening came from, my stubbornness, even that subtle mole on my wrist. They were inheritances, not just genetic, but of a history, of a people. It was a slow, exhaustive path, but every new connection, every name added to my family tree, was a brick in the reconstruction of my own self. I was, for the first time, sensing the possibility of finally belonging, not to a sham, but to a truth. And that truth, however painful its origin, began to flourish, bringing with it the promise of a new beginning. The echo of a lost past was beginning to transform into the melody of a rewritten future. The truth, when it finally unfolded before me, was like a blast of cold, cutting wind. It liberated me, yes, from the fog of lies that had suffocated my life for so long, but it also left me with a deep, exposed, throbbing scar. It was a painful freedom, the feeling of having the ground ripped out from under my feet only to realize that I had never truly known where I was stepping. The faces of my former family, those I loved and blindly trusted, were now ghosts in my thoughts. Every memory, every shared laugh, every hug, everything was stained. I saw them in a new and terrible light, and the betrayal was a poison running through my veins. The anger was a fire, consuming any remnant of affection I could still harbor. How could I forgive those who stole my own history, my identity, my chance to be who I truly was from the start? The idea of cutting ties, of ripping out that rotten root once and for all, was seductive. It was the promise of relief, of an end to the pain they caused me. But, at the same time, there was an emptiness. Years of life could not be erased with a simple gesture. They were years that, however false in their foundation, shaped me. Meanwhile, The threads of my true family, those that the neighbor Esther helped me unravel, began to weave into a vibrant tapestry. Yellowed photographs of smiles that looked like mine, stories of resilience and love, letters that spoke of a past that was now mine. Distant great-aunts and uncles, cousins I didn't even know existed, all with a piece of my essence. Every call, every new voice on the phone, every email with a story, was a balm for the open wound. It was the feeling of finally fitting in, of belonging to something real, palpable, that was not built on quicksand. But the choice was not simple. It wasn't just about embracing this new family and turning my back on the past. It was about who I wanted to be in the midst of it all. I could give into anger and resentment, letting the bitterness define me. I could isolate myself, protecting myself from future pain, but losing the chance for true, unconditional love. Or I could choose reconstruction, an arduous but liberating path. The reconstruction of my life was not just about finding out who I was, but about deciding who I wanted to be. It was about taking the fragments of my shattered existence and, with my own hands, assembling a new mosaic. A mosaic where truth would be the foundation, where honesty would be the predominant color. It would not be a path of forgetting, but of resignification. The scars would remain, yes, as maps of battles won, reminding me of my strength and my ability to survive. I thought of the faces of my new family. They welcomed me with a warmth I never knew existed. There was no judgment, only an unconditional acceptance of who I was, with all my pains and my discoveries. It was an embrace that healed. And then, I realized. My choice was not just between forgiving or cutting ties with the past, it was about choosing the future. It was about giving myself the chance to live an authentic life, surrounded by people who saw the real me. I decided I would not allow the betrayal of others to turn me into a bitter person. I didn't want their lie to be my heaviest inheritance. My inheritance would be my strength, my resilience, and my capacity to love and be loved, even after so much pain. The reconstruction would be slow, brick by brick, feeling by feeling. But it would be mine. My truth. My choice. My life. And, for the first time in a long time, I felt I was in control, navigating a stormy sea, yes, but with a map I was drawing myself. The melody of a rewritten future began to take its first chords, and I was ready to sing my own song. That following Christmas, the snow fell again, covering the world in a white, silent blanket. But the landscape in my soul was, finally, different. The white was no longer the shroud of a shattered life, but the immaculate canvas upon which I began to paint my own destiny. I remembered that other Christmas, the brutal revelation, like a distant nightmare, a turning point so painful it almost consumed me. Now, a year later, I was a new person, forged not only in pain, but in the resilience that pain forced me to discover. Life took everything from me, yes, but it gave me the truth, and with it, the strength to completely redefine myself. The scar was still there, an indelible mark on the fabric of my existence, but it was no longer an open wound. It was a map, a constant reminder of where I had been and the price I paid for my ignorance. It taught me to distrust the surface, to seek depth, to value authenticity above any facade. Those who deceived me, who built their happiness on my disillusionment, became distant shadows, figures from a past that I decided no longer to feed with my energy. There was no forgiveness, not in the traditional sense of reconciliation, but there was something more powerful, detachment. I cut the ties not with anger, but with a chilling clarity, protecting myself from any future contamination. My peace was worth more than the illusion of a family that never was. My cry, which had begun to take its first chords, was now a clear and strong melody. I sang my own song, with every choice, with every step. I gave up the name that was imposed upon me and proudly embraced what was mine by right, the surname that carried the true story, the true lineage. It was a symbolic act, but one of overwhelming depth. It was like being reborn, not just in body, but in identity, in soul. Every time I signed a document, every time I introduced myself, I felt the gravity and the liberation of that truth echoing in my voice. The new family, those I discovered in the eye of the hurricane, became my safe harbor, my foundation. With them, I learned what unconditional love was, trust without reservation. They were not blood ties in the strictest sense, but ties of the soul, forged in the storm and tempered by genuine affection. That Christmas, the table was full of real laughter and stories, without suffocating secrets or false smiles. For the first time in my life, I felt I belonged, that I was seen and loved for who I truly was, and not for the character I was forced to play. The story of that bitter Christmas became, in fact, the legacy of truth. A reminder that even in the biggest lies, in the densest darkness, truth always finds a way to emerge. And when it emerges, however painful it may be, it brings with it the potential for radical transformation. My journey has just begun, I knew that. There was still much to discover about myself, about the world, about what I wanted to build. But now, I was writing it with my own hands, without predetermined scripts, without imposed characters. I was the author, the protagonist, the director of my own life. And this was the most impactful and revealing freedom I could have. Human resilience, I realized, was not just the capacity to endure, but the audacity to bloom again, stronger and more authentic than ever.